Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. This is Mike Schoenfeld, one of the managing partners of EB5 Affiliate Network, and I'm joined today by Reed Thomas and also my partner, Sam Silverman. And today we're going to be discussing EB5 general partner management and best practices, and also layering in how NES Financial provides a lot of the solutions that assist with these practices. Next slide. So additionally today, we're going to start by going through who we are and a little bit more about our company. Then we're going to go through the overall scope of work that a general partner performs, then discuss a little more on the financial and immigration management details of what you have to do as an EB5 general partner, dive into some of the services that NES Financial provides in assistance, and then quickly talk about a current EB5 project and go through a question and answer session. And I apologize in advance if there's any background noise from any of the speakers. Working from home always comes with challenges with some nearby construction, so I appreciate you bearing with us. So on the next slide, one of the things that we've recently done is launched an all-new TEA map. This is a fully automated map where if you want to check if an EB5 project qualifies as a targeted employment area, you enter in your address, and our tool automatically qualifies whether it automatically calculates whether it can qualify through any of the approved methodologies. So it's a really cool tool, and I highly recommend checking it out. Next slide. Additionally, we have a completely free EB5 Guidebook that's available for download online as a PDF. It compiles all of the information we've learned and put together on the EB5 space and is a great resource to get started. Additionally, if you prefer a hard copy, you can buy it on Amazon and they'll ship out a print copy to you. Next slide. So now we're going to speak a little bit about who we are and our guest speakers. Next. So I'm Mike Schoenfeld in the middle of the slide. I'm joined by my partner, Sam Silverman. And as you can tell, our backgrounds are all on the slide, and we come from more of an institutional side of finance, big law, and also real estate development. We launched EB5AN almost 8 years ago, and what we wanted to do was bring more of our institutional background into the EB5 space and build a best-in-class operation to assist developers and investors in finding the right project, and for developers, helping them structure EB5 investments to be suitable for the developments that they're working on. Next slide. So we were started in 2013, and since then we've become one of the leaders in the EB5 industry with over 14 approved regional centers that we operate. We've had over 1,800 investors submit their I-526s across all of our regional centers with an extremely high success rate of I-526 approvals, and over $4 billion of real estate development projects, along with some other types of deals, have been created underneath all of our regional center licenses. Next slide. So to give you an idea of the regional center coverage that we have, and for context for anybody that doesn't know, a regional center is a license that the government, USCIS, approves that can sponsor EB5 projects in certain geographic areas. And with the sponsorship, you're allowed to calculate job creation using a more favorable methodology that's easier to track and leads to higher jobs. So a vast majority of EB5 applicants do go through regional centers, and we've built a regional center network that covers a majority of the country and are able to sponsor high quality projects that meet our immigration and risk criteria. The next slide. And one of the things that we are most proud of is that we do have EB5 investors that have come from over 60 countries around the world. EB5 investors consistently find value in the solutions that we provide and the type of projects that we structure. So we hope to continue to grow the number of countries where investors have come from over the next several years. Next slide. And now I'll turn it over to Reed so he can introduce himself, and he's our guest speaker from NES Financial today.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here. Reed Thomas. I am the Chief Revenue Officer and Managing Director for a company called JTC, formerly NES Financial. We were recently acquired. So as I talk about some of the capabilities we have today, I'll cover a little bit of both. We've been, as a company, in the EB5 business active since 2010. We got started with this idea that we could build technology to help well-intended investment initiatives ultimately do the good that they're intending to do. And so EB5 being focused on both job creation as well as helping potential investors or immigrants pursue the American dream. Both of those are good causes, and we wanted to be part of it. So what we did was built a purpose-built solution specifically to help EB5 issuers and regional centers, general partners, manage the operations to help ensure success for their investors. Next slide.
Excellent.
So go ahead and build it out if you wouldn't mind. So our company, has been recognized for quite a few technology awards over the years, as you can see there. We build our own technology. We call it eStack, which is a technology platform that stands for security, transparency, audit, and compliance. And as I mentioned before, it's been purpose-built or purpose-configured to work specifically with EB5. If you could build one more, I think that would be helpful. So you can see as we go through over time. Over time, we've had quite a bit of success in EB5. We're fairly well known. We've been contracted on over 700 EB5 projects to provide our solutions and services like we do for EB5 affiliate network. And that by far makes us the largest provider of these kinds of services. We found that investors in many cases look at the regional centers or projects they're considering investing in, and take note of the fact when NES Financial JTC is involved. On EB5, like I said, over 700 projects. We currently still have over 190 of them active at some stage of the EB5 life cycle. And overall, as a business, we're administering over $130 billion in funds globally. Next slide. Back to you, Mike.
Great. And now we're about to dive into the meat of the presentation. Please note that we will have these slides available for email afterwards. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we can cover some of them at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So to lay the groundwork of what we're going to discuss today and how to frame out the general partner role, I think it's helpful to look at a typical structure chart for EB5. So if you're looking at the slide, the top row, so you have the EB5 investors are in the middle. Those investors all invest into the box below where it says partnership name, and this is typically structured as a new limited partnership where the EB5 investors all buy a unit of. Historically, it was at $500,000. Now it's at $900,000. This limited partnership is sponsored by a regional center, and the regional center's job is to report to USCIS annually on the investors in the project and on the project status. Now, the top left box, this is where we're really going to be focusing on today, and that's the general partner. So this is the manager of the limited partnership. In a typical private equity deal, this is the entity and the people making the investment decisions and managing the funds. That's also the case in EB5, but in addition, the general partner is also typically responsible for a lot of the immigration side and keeping track of all of that information. In some deals, the general partner is the same as the regional center and it's the same group of people. In other deals, they're separate parties. And in some deals, the developer is also part of these two. And in a little while, we'll get through pros and cons of each of those structures. So if we move down to the bottom half of the chart, this isn't as critical for what we're going to be discussing today, but you can see how the different funds flow from the limited partnership down into a borrower that contributes it to a development company, which is where the real estate development is actually happening. And in that company, there's typically many equity partners, a senior lender, and potentially other sources of capital that all build up to being the project itself. Next slide. So what does an EB5 general partner actually do? The key roles that the EB5 GP has are twofold. One is on financial management, and the second is on immigration management. On the financial side, the general partner is involved in the same way they would be with a typical investment limited partnership. There's administration. If it's an EB5 loan, the GP needs to administer the loan and ensure everything's in compliance. If it's an equity agreement, they're still administering all of that component of it. All of the record keeping needed on behalf of the investors and the capital that's contributed and the returns that are generated, annual accounting, annual tax filings, financial reporting, and all of the duties that a general partner should serve in terms of overseeing the investment and keeping the investors updated on what's happening. The second piece is on the immigration side. This is where it's a little bit more specific to EB5. The GP is also quite often the one running the immigration side. Sometimes the regional center can do this, but in this case, we'll discuss it as a GP role where there's record keeping involved with these investors when their capital is contributed, proving that it remains at risk, all of the relationships of dealing with these investors, and the I-829 compliance at the end of the immigration process. Next slide. So as we're building them out, on the first part of financial management, so the things to dig into, loan administration. The key components of this involve collecting interest payments, monitoring the progress of the project and the loan draws, and making sure that the loan stays and meets all of the covenants and that you're enforcing your rights. Ideally, in a good deal, nothing goes wrong, but especially as we've seen with the recent pandemic and historical recessions, things can change, and the job of the GP is to administer the loan and ensure everything stays in compliance. Additionally, there's a lot of mid and back office documentation, which includes the record keeping of all of the flow of funds and making sure that everything is being recorded the right way so that you can follow the breadcrumbs for exactly how money has been invested and what it's been spent on. In addition to that, there's also escrow accounts that are quite often managed by NES Financial, where capital initially comes in. There's also the fund management side of managing the limited partnership, making the distributions, and splitting up and according to the waterfall, how things are going to flow. And then the standard accounting of having the accountant step in to prepare all the returns, issue the K1s, and all of those components that the general partner is responsible for. So the general partner is really responsible for managing the limited partnership and has a duty to do that. That's what it signed up for. And there's a lot of moving pieces in terms of general partner management. And I'll let Reed jump in here if there's anything that I'm missing here of what he sees as a typical GP role.
Well, I think the important part, Mike, is you touched on it. While it sounds like traditional fund administration, because it does really look like a private equity fund in many ways, the EB5 elements add an interesting twist. And I know as we'll talk through some of the other points, those are really critical and very important to have made right, because at the end of the day, right, being the fiduciary to the limited partners, the limited partners or investors, their motivations might be a little bit different. Well, I think they're definitely a little bit different than in a traditional private equity fund, in that there's this very desired immigration component.
Perfect. That's exactly right. Next slide, please, Jeremy. All right. So then the second piece of the GP scope moves on from that financial to more of that immigration that Reed was discussing, where there's a whole host of things that as an EB5 general partner you need to do that's much different than a typical general partner in a limited partnership. So these things focus on the record keeping on the EB5 side, subscription agreements, the source of funds documents, all of the USCIS correspondence, and ensuring you're fully up to date on where different investors stand in the immigration process. And NES has great tools which assist in this record keeping. On the compliance side, whether the GP is the regional center or there's a separate regional center involved, coordinating all of the information to get to the regional center and ensuring the proper reporting is being completed. On the I-829 side. So this is the form that is filed towards the end of the immigration process after the investor has had a conditional green card for 2 years. So the GP needs to help coordinate the documentation backup required to be able to submit these I-829s and ensure that all of the EB5 investors do a favorable immigration outcomes. And then lastly, all of the investor relations of providing quarterly reports and updates and transparency on what is going on in the investment. I know as EB5 investors should, they want to be treated the same way as an investor in any other deal. So you should be focused on providing the reports and treating them similarly to how other general partners would treat their limited partners. And I know Reed mentioned some of these, but is there anything else you'd like to highlight on the immigration side?
Well, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that this is, in terms of best practices at least, this is a good area where outsourcing to a third party might be something to consider, because coming from most general partners or developers or coming out of the private equity space, this type of detail is all new and it's high stakes for the investor. So it's a good opportunity to consider outsourcing this element of it.
Exactly. So now we're going to dive into each component that we've spoken about on the financial and the immigration side. And this is a relatively long slide deck, so we may not cover every single bullet point on here, but we'll go through the most important things on each of these subcomponents. Next slide, please. Next slide. So on the financial management best practices, let's go to the next slide. So we're first going to dig into ensuring the proper flow of funds. This is critical for two main reasons in EB5. First is for USCIS purposes, you need to show directly that the EB5 funds went into the new commercial enterprise, which is the limited partnership, was then contributed or loaned to the job creating enterprise and ended up in the entity that's directly responsible for creating the jobs. This is important on the immigration component, to where if you don't track this accurately or funds don't flow the right way, the immigration status of all the investors could be jeopardized. So that's why it's critical to know how to manage the flow of funds, keep all of the information, and have all of the backup. And the key subcomponents of this, timely moving the money into the project. If you're repaying a bridge loan, making sure it's done on time and in the fashion that's described, keeping all of the backup documentation for every transfer. You would be surprised at how big of a stack of paper you need for these immigration filings at the end. So keeping everything properly organized and annotated for the flow of funds for every investor is absolutely critical. Additionally, in some of the smaller developers out there that are used to operating as a family business, we've seen where they move funds from one fund to another and use it as if it's their personal bank account, which is absolutely not allowed. So the general partner's role is to oversee the developer and ensure that the funds are being used exactly as anticipated and as described in the offering memorandum. A lot of times it's not bad intentioned developers that do this, but just people that are used to their business practices, which does not work with EB5 and does not work with the securities documents and compliance that are needed. And lastly, the at-risk rule. So as the general partner, it is your role to ensure that the EB5 investors' funds stay at risk throughout the entire immigration process. And this has been a sticking point. Historically, USCIS has said that the funds need to stay at risk until final I-829 approval, which can be many years. After the I-526 is approved and the investor gets their conditional green card, there's a 2-year conditional period. At that point, an investor is allowed to submit their I-829 application, which could still take several years to adjudicate. So if you're an investor that's from a backlog country, let's say, your funds may have to be at risk for a period of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. And just because the funds are at risk does not mean that it has to be risky. So once the primary investment is done that creates the jobs, it's up to the regional center and the general partner, primarily the general partner, to find a suitable investment to keep those funds at risk to meet USCIS requirements and to minimize the risks on the investor's behalf. So there's lots of different key components to making sure that the funds flow in the right direction and stay at risk in the right manner. And all of that is managed by the general partner. And I know Reed has worked on several solutions for all of these pieces. And maybe you can touch on a few of the solutions that you have to monitor the flow of funds and the at-risk and all of these different components before we go to the next slide.
Yeah, I can go into some detail on that. I think at this point, maybe it's helpful just to really focus on one, which is the documentation piece. Just to give a perspective for the listeners, you said, Mike, that the typical process might take 7 or 10 years to ultimately complete. But the audit trail from a documentation perspective starts on the very first day and sort of ends at the very last day. So there's documentation all the way along. So it's critical to have the right procedure in place to collect those documents so that at the end of the day, the audit trail and evidence is there. And it can be per investor, something like 2,000 to 3,000 pages of documentation to ultimately comply with all the immigration requirements.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people stumbling into the EB5 space or just getting started don't realize how much compliance there is. And a lot of the historical operators that were smaller didn't realize everything that they needed to do and didn't have a clear picture on this, and would have been much better served by working with a company like NES to provide these solutions.
Right.
All right, next slide, please. So the next piece of this involves more of the general partner getting involved to ensure funds are being spent the right way. There's going to be lots of different covenants in the loan agreement and the way that funds should flow and what they need to be used for, but it's always helpful for the general partner to serve as that double check in ensuring get the financial records that all the funds are being done. If it's a loan style project, the general partner is the lender in the deal and needs to do everything that a lender would in terms of keeping compliance on ensuring that all of the loan covenants are met. Additionally, you can ask for all the documentation that you'd like, but we think that a best practice is doing site visits, ensure that construction is going on, making sure that things are being done as being said. One of the things that happens quite often is you're able to piggyback on a senior lender that's involved in the deal that is doing draws and draw requests and doing very frequent inspections. And being able to get on that distribution is very helpful to be able to double check the EB5 is being spent correctly. And lastly, something you never want to talk about, but there has been fraud, not just in EB5, but all across the financial industry. So as the general partner, your job is to make sure there's no fraud and that money is being spent as it should and the project's moving along as it should. So you are the general partner and should treat it as if you were managing not EB5 money, but any other limited partner's money. And I'll let Reed jump in here as well.
Yeah, on that point, I think it's important. There are a lot of related party projects within the EB5 community, and that enables fraud to be easier to get done than otherwise. But just like any sort of financial fund transaction, the best practice here is really to have an independent third party involved in doing the administration of the fund. The most famous case, of course, was the Bernie Madoff case, which had nothing to do with EB5, obviously. But at that time, only 5% of hedge funds, outsourced the administration of the fund. After that, now 95% of them do to help prevent fraud. So it's a best practice, certainly in the fund industry, but in particular, very, very important in EB5. And investors are aware of this. Limited partners are looking for this to be part of this solution set.
Excellent. Next slide. So one piece that is unique to EB5 is that EB5 needs to be used directly in the project. So we often get the question, can I use EB5 funds to pay for EB5 documentation, to pay other EB5 related costs? And the best practice is no. The money should go directly from the NCE into the job creating enterprise. Every penny of the $900,000 needs to go in, and you should be able to show exactly it going into the job creating enterprise and being spent out of there. So, so as you can see, there are certain pieces of this, the administrative fee, the different interest rate, the eligible expenses, and all of those things need to be tracked and ensured that EB5 is being spent directly on what it's supposed to be. Next slide. And then lastly, just following accounting best practices. You are a general partner here. Managing funds, you should be following all best practices in terms of the financial accounting, tax compliance, all of the reporting requirements to the IRS. We have a whole separate webinar on this that you can view. And I'll let Reed jump in to kind of round out any other takeaways that he has on the financial side of just general partner best practices on everything financial.
Well, I think that in EB5, each investor is on it's a little bit unique in that each investor is on their own journey with their own timeline, and each investor has an obligation to provide the evidence that would support their final immigration benefit. And to that end, you know, it can be tricky because you have sort of fungible, if you will, fund level in an investment that you need to track, but from a tracking and accounting perspective, as well as a compliance perspective, comes back down to every individual limited partner, which creates some interesting complexities in terms of the overall process and reporting. So the best, you know, in terms of best practices, obviously the thing that I think we see EB5 issuers and general partners do is provide a ton of transparency to their investors in terms of what's happening with their individual investment, the status of their immigration process, et cetera, all along the way.
Excellent. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into the immigration side. So overall, there's several different components on the immigration side, which is different from the financial side. First is having all of the records for the immigration component. Next is knowing the investor's immigration status, tracking that, tracking the job creation, and if redeployment is required, getting all of that lined up ahead of time. So let's dive into the details here. Next slide. On the complete records portion, you want to have everything related to that investor, including their subscription agreement, their passport, their source of funds information, and everything that would be required, both from an SEC compliance and also from a U.S. immigration compliance. This includes all of the correspondence with USCIS, the 797 notice that USCIS did receive the application. All of the backup of the source of funds is going to be kept with the immigration attorney, but the GP and regional center should understand a general sense of the source of funds. And also, it's critical to keep contact information. People change email addresses, phone numbers, but staying current with all of that is good so that you can always get in touch with the investors and there's never any issues with not being able to reach them. And one thing to note here is that a couple of years ago, USCIS started doing compliance reviews on regional centers. So going in and checking all of the processes in place. So it's important to have all of this backup. And Reed, what else do you think we should add about maintaining these records?
Well, I think the key thing is there should be a periodic audit that the general partner or regional center is doing to identify documentation that might be missing along the way. That's another thing that we've seen as kind of a best practice as well.
Exactly. Next slide. And this component is where having a good tracking tool like NES is really helpful, is knowing the immigration status of each investor. So as the investor files their I-526 and moves through the process, they could be in different stages, including have filed an I-526 but not approved, an approved I-526 that has not adjusted status, so there's no temporary green card, has a temporary green card but not filed the 829, filed the 829, still has the temporary green card but isn't approved yet. All of those types of things need to be tracked, and having a roll-up view of this is extremely helpful. And NES is an immigration workflow, which helps to track where everyone is in this life cycle. And additionally, when investors are going through, they will get some RFEs and NOIDs, requests for evidence, notice of intent to deny, and being able to provide all of this backup information is critical to help answer these different pieces. So the best practice as the GP is to be able to provide the immigration attorney in the regional center with a full package of information at the time of I-829 filing. So being organized and record keeping is definitely a good best practice. And Reed, can you jump in and tell us a little bit more about the immigration workflow and some of the unique things that it provides to sponsors?
Right. The immigration workflow is a product capability that we developed, as Mike says, to really help manage all of the complexity associated with this. As I said before, each investor is on their own journey and own timeline. There may be different issues that come up along the way for them, such as request for evidence, as an example, on a specific application or a petition that's unique to that individual investor. But there's many other things that are common to the investors that are important to capture as evidence along the way. And I think that the tool we've created is really helpful to help sort of flag for a general partner key critical items. So it tracks the timing between different events in each individual investor's process, so it can highlight that there's something that the general partner needs to pay attention to or take care of, because the timing on responses, et cetera, to the immigration service really matter. And mistakes here can ultimately adversely affect the investor's immigration status, which, as we said up front, is really the primary motivation for making the investment, right? So can't underestimate how important it is to have sort of a dashboard, which the tool provides, so that general partners can stay on top of this stuff.
Exactly. At the end of the day, these investors care most about ensuring they get their green cards and they're made permanent. So you have to keep all those records to ensure that.
Right.
Next slide. And one component of ensuring that each investor does get their green card is job creation. This is a job creation program. Every investor needs to create 10 new jobs. Projects should be structured appropriately at the start. Obviously, conditions change. So, for example, if you were operating a hotel during the start of the pandemic, revenue would have gone way down. And if you were relying completely on revenue for job creation, you'd be in a bit of a challenge. So part of what the regional center will be doing and what the general partner needs to do is stay on top of the job creation, ensure everything is on track for investors to earn their permanent green cards, and adjust accordingly. So part of the annual filing on the I-924A is estimated job creation. So you are reporting this yearly, but where this comes into the most important piece is at the 829 stage, where you need all of the detailed backup to prove that 10 jobs were created for each investor. Next slide. And lastly, one of the other points is redeployment. So towards the end of the investment, redeployment might be needed because individual EB5 investors are all on different timelines, as Reed mentioned. So some of them may be finished in time, but for others, the project may be completed and sold prior to them earning their permanent green card. So then you have to redeploy their funds depending on how the documents are set up. So there have been new rules implemented recently from USCIS that the funds do have to be redeployed in a relatively short time frame, within 12 months, into the same geography of regional center coverage where the initial funds were deployed. And tracking all this is also important to have the backup showing the government that the funds were at risk all the way through the process. So redeployment is a very sticky issue. A lot of it's governed by the investment documents and the limited partnership agreement. And it's important to stay on top of this and keep investors informed as well. So there's lots of moving pieces to redeployment, and we have a webinar on that by itself because it is such a thorny topic. And I know Reed has a lot to say about redeployment and tracking and different solutions they've worked on and tried. So I'll let him jump in here and really go through what they've seen with redeployment and what some of the best practices are that they've noticed from their overview.
Yeah, this is a really tricky part of it, and in some ways it's unfortunate that redeployment is really even a topic, right, Mike? Because the initial idea was that the immigration process itself should occur within a time period that only sort of one deployment of capital is necessary. However, with sort of the long wait lines that now exist, and sort of slow processing times, in order to maintain capital at risk, it's often necessary to redeploy into a second project, if you will, or into a second investment to maintain the at-risk status. So in some ways that's not ideal, obviously, because the investor did all of their due diligence and assessment on the first investment. That's what was the best understood. And 5 years or 7 years later, the capital needs to be redeployed after the investor may have already created the jobs that were necessary. So investor went through let's say a risky investment and now has to sort of do it all over again. So it's unfortunate. I think that in terms of best practices, the most important thing is transparency, making sure investors are well aware of what's happening. So Mike's advice about acting early is super smart. But keep in mind, that this is in the best interest of the investor is really, something that's obviously meets the standard of at risk, but also recognizes the fact that they may have already achieved their desired investment outcome, which was to create the jobs required for permanent or for ultimately citizenship, permanent residency and citizenship. So trying to find the right balance in terms of risk and compliance is critical.
Exactly. Next slide. And the last piece of the immigration component, and this also is related to the financial component, is just communication. EB5 investors are limited partners. They're investors in the deal. They want to be kept up to date. So being able to provide regular and transparent communication is very helpful to ensure investors know what's going on, have an idea of where they are in the process, how the deal is going, if the jobs are being created, and all of the typical things that they may be reaching out to ask about. A good way to get ahead of investor questions is to issue quarterly or semi-annual reports, which give all the updates which they may want to ask about. This saves everybody time. The investors don't have to reach out, and they're able to stay updated on everything. Additionally, sometimes it's helpful to provide these updates to the immigration attorneys as well, so they know where things stand in the process on the project. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to Reed for a little while to run through all of the different solutions. And as you'll see, the NES solutions map up pretty well to the key components that we discussed. And for them, it's adding a technology layer, which helps to be a best in practice organization of the fund's full life cycle, both on the financial side and on the immigration side. And with that, I'll turn it over to Reed.
Thanks, Mike. So the EB5 process, as we discussed, in some ways is just like any other private equity fund, where you would go out, you have to raise capital, sort of step one, step two, then you deploy it, and then step three, ultimately you benefit from the distributions or the return of capital. So in that sense, it's exactly like any other sort of real estate fund, private equity fund. However, it's really more complex because there's these different sort of administrative processes that have to go on that Mike's talked about. And so really it's a mashup. The way we look at it is, EB5 is a mashup of a private equity fund with an immigration program and a job creation program, all rolled into one. And so when you think about the administration or the back office requirements as a general partner or regional center for this, you have to think about addressing all three of those ultimately if the limited partners are going to get the benefits that they're looking for. And so we approached it by developing solutions in the three areas shown here. The capital administration, sort of how money moves, when it moves, that part of it, because that's very, very important to ultimately, not only the project being successful, in terms of getting capital when needed, but also in terms of complying with the rules, the immigration rules, to ultimately be successful. Then there's the sort of administrative processes related to the fund itself, and tracking all the documentation associated with that for both the support for job creation that Mike just talked about, as well as immigration that we talked about. And then finally, of course, it's a typical fund, so you have to do the financial reporting at the fund level. Most EB5 projects, most EB5 investments are set up as loans, and so there's a loan administration component to it as well. And so we've developed solutions for all of these different areas. We haven't talked a lot about escrow, and I'll talk about that more in a second, but that the escrow component is a lot more complicated than it might seem in other circumstances. So let's jump into the next slide, please. This is a helpful diagram I found to articulate what has to happen in the EB5 process. We've said, look, at the end of the day, the investor's primary motivation is a successful immigration result. And so general partners need to keep that in mind, and make sure that the appropriate audit trail is captured. And that creates, in order to do that, there's a balance, right? The sort of documentation and evidence that investors are going to require needs to be lined up with what the job creating entity or the developer requires in terms of ultimately creating a successful project and creating the jobs. And so it starts with subscription escrow. Money typically flows into an escrow account, which is really an aggregation account for the limited partners subscription funds. And as Mike pointed out, it's very important to track subscription funds separately than administration funds. So there's some complexity there. The escrow can be also very complicated because there's very few banks in the United States that want to do EB5 escrows. And the big reason for that is because it's 100% foreign money. There has been a history of fraud and abuse. The overall market is relatively small compared to some of the things other larger banks deal with. And so it's very sort of nuanced and requires some expertise. So we took the approach of partnering with banks to facilitate the escrow solution and setup. Once the escrow triggers are met, the money needs to move into the new commercial enterprise. And this is really important, how it moves, when, all that stuff, because the new commercial enterprise is in fact what the investors are making an equity investment into. But that new commercial enterprise is then usually making a loan to the job creating entity or the developer. Oddly, in many cases, folks didn't set up really a construction drawdown. That's obviously a best practice in the construction and real estate industry, and something that certainly is a best practice here is to flow those funds through a drawdown account so that the money can be deployed in time and as needed for the job creating entity. Now, as the JCE, if you will, is doing what it's doing and doing construction, the general partner regional center needs to capture necessary evidence to show that the money was spent and creating jobs. So that's an important element. Then ultimately, once all the jobs are created, the project's complete, capital needs to be returned. And then that again is another opportunity for escrow. So that's how the money flows. Over on the left, at the end of the day, I try to simplify this down to what are the things that really need to be proven as evidence along the way. Because the audit trail for 829, which is the end and the ultimate objective for the investor, that starts at the very beginning, which is many years from when this project completes. So along the way, need to show that the new commercial enterprise was established. And so there's examples of the type of evidence that can be use to support that. And hit the next build, please. And so the next step is that the Immigration Service is going to want to see that the full capital amount was invested. So that's the $500,000 or now $900,000 or 1.8 million that needs to be proven that that wasn't actually invested. So escrow is a great tool to help support that. Because we can monitor very closely money in and money out. And so in fact, what we do is we actually track wire confirmation receipts for each individual investor's money in, money out. And then we have this part happens. And that's also why it's very important not to track individual investors separately. At this point, to make sure you can show per investor that their full investment was in fact made. Next build, please. And then, of course, creation of 10 jobs. So these are the kinds of pieces of evidence that are often required to support that. You know, showing that if in the case of things like construction jobs, you know, showing that how much money was spent on different aspects. Different purchases, because there's different economic multipliers for that. The folks at EB5 Affiliate Network have a great tool for estimating that. But there might also be direct jobs, payroll employees, and so on. So capturing all of that along the way is really the third key element, proof point. And then finally, next build, please, is you have to show that the capital remained at risk. And so ongoing statements, regular investment statements, progress reports, those kinds of things, which our system does just as automatically, is key to showing that the investment at risk was actually sustained. So if you can do all of those things, then investors will be successful. So next slide, please. Yeah, next slide.
Excellent. Thanks, Reed. And as you can see by following that chart, it is quite a complicated path, and that's why having the right organization and right tools in place is critical to do your job as a general partner.
Yeah, right. And so this is just a helpful slide. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but you know, there have been cases of fraud in the EB5 industry, and in most cases, it's where you have related parties doing, you know, working like the developer is the same as the general partner, is the same as the regional center kind of thing, and there's been no third party involved. But you can see here where fraud, and so up top, sort of the process, that's just what we walked through, is the process of how funds have to move. And you can see that the majority of fraud tends to occur between once the money has hit the new commercial enterprise, and between that and the loan to the developer, which sort of highlights the importance of third-party administration over that aspect of the fund administration policy. And investors are aware of this type of thing. So as you structure your overall fund, you know, encourage you to think about the benefits of third party here to provide confidence to investors. Okay, next slide. We talked about the drawdown, so I think we can skip this over. This is just a typical, oh, I'll be very brief at least. This is, you know, commonly done in real estate construction and development, where there's a drawdown request that comes, it's verified, and then capital moves to meet the needs of the developer. So us as a third party can help verify those draw requests. Surprisingly, in the early days of EB5, this was not done very often. So definitely a best practice here. Next slide. So just a quick screenshot, and you know, our friends at EB5 Affiliate Network use this this platform, but this is for a general partner. This is kind of the view that I was talking about, where you have a dashboard where you can know exactly what's going on for the fund at all times. So this dashboard points out, look, you can see where funding is, how much funding's been deployed, how much target or capital has been raised, how much is left to be raised. There's an immigration dashboard that highlights critical items and so on that you can drill into and find and solve for specific investors. Obviously, there's tracking of where cash is as it moves through the different processes. So that's the associated accounts section. And then, on a per investor basis, where each investor is, where their money is at all times is what's tracked here. And so this is a tool that's available to general partners or regional center managers to do their thing. But there's also a portal that's available to investors so that they can see their own information pertinent to them, which gives them confidence in the overall investment. Next slide. Yeah, we talked about this enough. Next slide, in the interest of time. I think this is important because one of the things that we found was, a lot of investors, they have a lot of due diligence to do on the project in the regional center. And one of the aspects that was often overlooked early on was the due diligence with respect to how is the issuers that I'm investing in, how are they actually administering the capital? What are they actually doing to provide the protections and collect the evidence and all the details that we talked about? So we came out with this Medallion partner program. And the idea here was that we would award projects as well as partners or companies in the EB5 industry that we felt were advocates for best practices and in fact embraced best practices in everything that they did. And so we would award medallions to folks like that. EB5 Affiliate Network is a Medallion Platinum partner of ours. They have many Medallion Platinum projects or have been involved with many Medallion Platinum projects. And it includes not just the project itself, but it also extends to, well, what advisors are they using and who are they working for in the industry and what's their experience base. And we did this as a way to really sort of help investors ultimately recognize quickly who at least NES feels is embracing best practices in the industry. So investors should look for these kinds of Medallion awards, ask the potential issuers about it, because it's a way that hopefully will help speed up the due diligence process by providing some level of confidence. Next slide.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Reed. I think that's a really helpful overview for everybody that was thinking about like how does NES fit into the picture. So let's go to the next slide. And we're briefly going to discuss a current investment offering that we have as the general partner. So we quite often have worked with the Coulter Group, which is a large real estate development firm, about 50 active projects, over 500 employees that focuses on Florida and Southeast real estate in a few key segments. Coulter Urban is a high-rise and mid-rise condominium arm. Coulter Hospitality, where they build and operate hotels. And then Coulter Land and Coulter Homes, where Coulter buys large tracts of land, puts in the horizontal infrastructure, creates home sites, and then actually builds and sells these homes. Next slide. And the reason that we've chosen to work with Coulter on many deals where we place EB5 investors is that first and foremost, they're reputationally and financially strong. They made it through the 2008 recession without defaulting on a single loan and have finished every single project they started. That's key to us because we want to ensure that all investors first earn their green cards, and a completed project is important for that. And second, return all of their invested capital back at the end of the project. Next, they've won many awards, including Hyatt's Strategic Partner of the Year award. They've been strategically focused on the southeast of the U.S., and we believe in the macro trend. The pandemic has actually sped it up of people moving towards warm weather states with good lifestyles, lots of sun, and lower taxes, which is why Coulter has focused on the southeast of the United States, which has experienced a rapid population growth. And additionally, the management team at Coulter has been very stable, has worked together for a long time, and been part of many successful deals over the past few decades. Next slide. So we've got an overview of one of the projects here. Please reach out if you'd like more information. We can ensure you are an accredited investor and qualify for this investment before we share any detailed offering documents. But at the high level, this project is a targeted employment area project, which qualifies at the $900,000 level. Additionally, this is phase 2 of an already exemplar approved deal. So that means that the US CIS has already reviewed the first phase of this project and approved it, which is great news. So the government is familiar with this project. And this is also a follow-on of a previous project that we did in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is where this project is located. We worked on a very similar deal about 3 blocks away and were involved from the start on that. Saw the building go up, the condominium sold. We deployed EB5 capital in that deal. It was very successful. And when we found that the Coulter group was doing another project only a few blocks away, we decided to get involved. So for this deal, the investors do earn a 2% preferred return. There's $49.5 million of EB5 that's going to go into this project as a mezzanine loan. And there is a senior bank loan that's already executed with Wells Fargo. So this is a project that's well under construction. There's a strong amount of pre-sales of these condominiums, well over $100 million of pre-sales. They've already poured the foundation and are coming out of the ground. So it's one of the deals where a lot of the immigration risk has been taken off the table because it's well under construction, and the financial risk has been mitigated because of the fact that there have been pre-sales, and it's looking like a very successful project. So again, if you have any questions on this or would like more details, please reach out, and we're happy to share more information. Next slide. And with that, we'd like to open it up to a couple of questions that we may have received during the presentation. We are coming up on the hour mark, so we're probably going to answer a few of these, but I would suggest that you reach out to us afterwards. Please flip to the next slide so that we have the contact information on the screen. You can reach out to us. Oh, sorry, there was one other. Sorry, Rita. So there is a new NES and JTC webinar, and you can sign up for that. It'll be at the end of the month. And then on the last slide, we have our contact information so that you know where to reach us, either NES Financial, the info at nesfinancial.com, or our company at info@eb5am.com. Jeremy, if you'd like to read a couple questions, we can answer one or two of the most common questions that we received during the webinar.
Okay, hi Mike. All right, we've got I think we got just about time for one question here, and that is, what if the project was sold at a loss and the full $500K value of the investor's capital is no longer available? Great question.
That is, and there's a few different aspects to that. I'd say one is on the EB5 side, which is the key. And the question to that on the immigration process is, was the money invested in the deal? Did it create all the jobs? And if so, is the investor allowed to be repaid? So if you're at the end of the process and unfortunately it was not a successful financial deal for whatever reason, but all of the jobs were created and all the money was originally invested, the investor does still qualify to earn their permanent green card, although there would be a financial loss. You do have to separate out the financial side of a deal with the immigration side. On the immigration side, the focus is on creating those 10 jobs and putting the capital at risk. And to the government, that's enough. Obviously, it's great if the project is successful, but if you meet the requirements, the U.S. government does not penalize you if there was a financial issue with the deal and you did meet all the other requirements. On the other hand, as an investor, obviously you'd like to get your money back at the end of the project, so it's absolutely critical to do diligence on the deal and make sure you're investing in a deal where you're not likely to lose any of the principal. And with that, so we've hit the hour. So we'd like to thank everybody for your time on watching the webinar. There will be a recorded version, and please reach out if you'd like the slides sent to you. Additionally, for any other questions, you have our emails on the screen. And we want to thank you again for the time that you spent with us. And we'll hopefully we'll be hearing from you soon. Thank you.